Or to this. Andy, the show is yours.
All righty. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to your Ham Radio Club meeting. My name is Andy Stewart. I'm a KB1OIQ, and I'm from the Deep South in Westford, Massachusetts, and happy to join you this evening. Thankfully, rush hour traffic wasn't too bad for a Friday night. And so this is my first time here, so thank you very much for making me feel very welcome here. I want to talk about Linux and ham radio. We've got about 3, 6, 7, 8, 9 people here, and I guess probably 15 or more on Zoom. And so I can't see everybody's hands going up, but I hope that there's a bunch of you that have tried it. I know people have had a variety of experiences with it, both good and bad. And I'm hoping that the work I've done here, if you should try it, would make things a whole lot better. So just a little bit of information about me. I joined the ham radio hobby in '07, and I got my general and extra licenses shortly thereafter. In Westford, Mass, I was the president of the PART group, the Police Amateur Radio Team, for about 10 years. And I stepped back from that to let somebody else do it. And George K1IG has done a fine job ever since that. Did a couple of years as vice president as well. I played around with the EMA section for a while, Eastern Massachusetts, with a couple of roles. I founded my first Linux users group back in 1997 when I lived in Worcester. The closest group at the time was in Boston. And while they're cool guys, I just didn't want to drive all the way to Boston from Worcester all the time. So I founded a group there, which is still going quite strongly, although I haven't participated in it in well over 10 years. There's still a core group that's keeping it going and having a lot of fun. Later, when I moved to Chelmsford and then afterwards to Westford, I founded the Chelmsford Linux Meetup group on meetup.com. And we haven't met since the beginning of COVID, and that's mostly my fault for not kickstarting it again. But we had quite a few people that would come meet us at first a local coffee shop and then at Panera Bread for just socializing and Linux talk. And of course, whenever a bunch of smart people get together, they're bound to talk about other things. And so the conversations were often very, very lively, and it was a lot of fun. For a while, I was a Linux instructor for the town's adult education at night. And I had a lot of fun with that for many years, teaching what I considered to be like Linux for a home user, and then a home sysadmin, setting up your own printer, setting up your own network, that kind of thing, when it wasn't quite as easy to do as it is today. But since I wasn't in ham radio at the time, I didn't discuss any of those sorts of things. I've been using Linux in '97, which was pretty early in the game. It was the kernel version was 0.99 patch level 4, so it wasn't even 1.0 yet. And I've been there ever since. And by day, I'm a computer engineer. I do digital logic verification with computer simulators, and I get paid to break things. And I can change my reality with 2 lines of code. Think about it. So most recently, my interests have been the following. I have been bitten by this bug that has drawn me to tube-based antique radios and bringing them back to life. Now, I can't engineer with tube circuits. I don't understand how all of them work, but I can drive a soldering iron and change wires and change capacitors and all of that. And I've had a lot of fun bringing a half a dozen or so radios back to life, as well as a couple of pieces of Heathkit test gear. And the toughest one was a 1940s AM/FM Zenith radio that I brought back to life for a friend who had it for 40 years and it only worked for 20 of them. And I said, I can't promise to be able to fix it, but I will try. And he's thrilled. He uses it daily and loves it. I've also been into home brewing. If there's a kit out there that requires soldering, I'm happy to do it. I love putting the kits together. My Elecraft amplifier was a kit, not with soldering, but mechanical assembly. I had fun putting that together and a whole bunch of other kits. MicroBitX, I spent a lot of time putting that together and rewriting all the firmware so that a visually impaired ham could access it. It's on SourceForge. I don't know if anybody's used it, but it's out there. And more recently, I built myself a 1920s style regenerative receiver because I was just rather fascinated how those worked. And a lot of the parts I used were from approximately that era. And so I had a lot of fun with that. And I've got 3 coils that I hand wound and plugged in for different frequency ranges from AM radio up to about 10 or 11 megahertz. So I have a lot of fun with that. I've used FT8 and the grid tracker software quite a bit. Sure, I'd rather have a contact in sideband or CW, but I'll take FT8 if that's all the bands will give me. And I'm okay with that. Fox hunting. I participate a lot with the local fox hunters. I have a 2-meter and 80-meter fox that I put out there, and I also like to go find the foxes when they put them out there. And it's a great excuse to get out there and get some fresh air and walk around and go find a fox. And of course, I do spend a fair amount of time on this software collection, which I call Andy's Ham Radio Linux. Now, you can tell I'm not a marketing person, I'm an engineer, and that's just how that goes. But I only wrote a few of the programs that are in that software collection. The rest were written by people all over the world, which are published with a free software license, so I can legally collect it and redistribute it and all of that. And that sort of thing is strongly encouraged in the Linux community. So my goals in creating that were the following. Well, of course, I want to promote Linux, and I know people often use Windows or some flavor of Apple computer and Linux as well. And this is my way, or one of my ways, to give back to the ham radio and Linux communities. I've learned a ton from various Elmers that I've had, from attending ham radio club meetings, conventions, and so forth, and similarly from the Linux community, both in person and online. And so this is one of the ways I think that I can put something together and get it out there for people so they can install it on their computer and just use it. Instead of constantly babysitting the computer, they can actually enjoy the radio part. And so that was one of my motivations. But I didn't want to build it from scratch. I'm not into Gen 2, but other folks are, and that's okay. So I took Ubuntu Linux and I did what's called remastering. So I changed the mixture of what software was in that software collection. And even though Ubuntu is done by a commercial company, this is still all perfectly legal and encouraged. And I just distribute it under the Andy's Ham Radio Linux name, and people are downloading it like crazy and having a lot of fun with it. So I looked around on the internet for as many ham radio programs that I could find that ran on Linux and had a free software or open source license. I'm big on that. I'm anti-proprietary as much as I can be, and I also don't have the legal right to distribute proprietary software, so I don't. But I also don't do anything to stop you from putting proprietary software on your Linux system if you should so choose. I might try to talk you out of it, but I'm not going to twist your arm. My goal is that everything just works. It's installed, all the libraries are there. You click the button in the menu and the application pops up and hopefully just works. Now, if it doesn't, go to that application's website and look up what's going on, and you can probably get some help. I can't be tech support for every application that's on there, but if you're installing it, I can help you through that. And I really want people to focus on the radio hobby, not babysitting yet another computer. But of course, computers are integral to the hobby now. Ideally, it just works and doesn't get in your way, but in fact enhances your enjoyment of the hobby. And so that's how the idea of Andy's Ham Radio Linux began. And I had created something for my own laptop. And I said, well, gee whiz, why can't I package this up and put it out there so everybody else can use it? And that started about 11 years ago. If you go to the SourceForge website and look for My Radio Linux, and you can download it from there and try it. So as I mentioned, it's a remastered version of Ubuntu Linux, specifically Xubuntu, or some people would say Xubuntu. The reason for the X is because that describes the default desktop environment that comes with it, which happens to be XFCE. You don't need to know that, but what you do know is there are many different desktop environments available on Linux, and pick and choose the one that is your favorite and use that. I picked this one because it's got a lot of modern features. It's got enough eye candy to keep most people happy, and it's relatively lightweight in terms of memory usage and CPU usage. So I chose that one. I go through a lot of work and I create the ISO file so that you have one file to download to do this. It is approximately 4 gigabytes. So if you have a slow internet, talk to me, buy me an adult beverage, and I'll put it on a thumb drive for you. And I've done that a few times, and I'm happy to do it. It's a piece of cake. So if you go on SourceForge, you can find the stuff and you can download it. The most recent version, which I came out with about not quite 2 months ago, is version 25, and it's only for 64-bit computers. I dropped 32-bit support about 3 or 4 versions ago because it was 10% or less of the total downloads. And if you've got a 13 or 14-year-old computer, please buy another one. I mean, there's things you can put on it, but if you're going to run any of the modern applications, you'll be disappointed. It just won't have the horsepower that you need. So there's a few ways to get started. Well, first, of course, you have to download the software. So go to SourceForge, download the ISO file. And if you have VirtualBox or some other similar software where you can, it's just, a computer within a computer, quite literally, boot it up in there and play with it and kick the tires and see how you like it. And within there, you can create a bootable USB thumb drive. And from there, you could put it on your favorite computer, laptop, whatever, and boot that and go through the installation. And 15 or 20 minutes later, depending on the speed of your computer and your disk drive and so forth, you should be able to reboot and have a working copy of Andy's Ham Radio Linux. There's a document I created called Getting Started, and you'd be surprised how many people don't read documentation. And you would be surprised at how many people have asked me the same question that's answered in the Getting Started guide. I don't know what else to do. I've named the document Getting Started and README, and it's the same document, and people still don't read it. So if you do this, please read it. You will save yourself a lot of trouble in one particular area that's a little bit of a wart, but you do it once and you're all set after that. And believe me, if I could fix that, I would. So some folks have asked me, well, I want to run it on an older laptop that I am not using for anything else. And so what are the requirements of such a machine? It doesn't have to be a laptop. It could be a desktop, but any x86 64 computer. So I don't think this will run on Apple computers, but any PC type computer that's 64 bits will work. My wet finger guess is 10 years old or less, so that you have sufficient resources, memory, disk space, and whatever. Now, if you have an older computer and you throw a newer disk in, sure, you could get away with that sort of thing. I would say as a minimum, 2 to 4 gigabytes of memory. And sure, that depends on how many programs you're going to run at a time and so forth. The disk space after installation is about 15 gigabytes. But I've had people tell me that the installer complains if they try to install in a 20 gigabyte partition because it thinks it needs 32 or something like that. So don't be afraid to give it a little bit of room. And these days, 100 gigabytes or more is really no big deal. So I don't think disk space should be a problem for people. Processor speed is not really an issue for most ham radio programs. I mean, your logger is not doing anything that's particularly compute intensive. Okay, most of your programs aren't. When you start getting into programs with waterfalls and things, a little bit more so, and SDR programs, especially if you're trying to decode broadcast FM, for example, can be a bit more compute intensive. Newer machines shouldn't have much of a problem with that. Older machines might. Try it, see what happens. You might get lucky. Or some would say, well, I don't run that kind of software, so I don't care. That's okay too. It'll work for the rest of the stuff. You definitely want to have a working network, whether it's wired or wireless, doesn't matter. You want to have that turned on before you do while you're doing the installation. Make sure that gets turned on, because there is software that it will want to download during the installation. And if you don't do that, the installation might fail. It may or may not, it depends. And I even listed that, a DVD required. Well, most people don't have DVDs on their computers anymore, but if you have a 10-year-old one, you might. And you can install it that way. That path used to work. But honestly, I haven't tested it in years, but I see no reason why that shouldn't work if that's what you have on an older computer. What you find on some older computers is they might not handle your 8 gigabyte USB drive, but they might handle one that's 4, for example. So your mileage may vary, but just be cognizant of those sorts of things if you try it on a much older computer. So when I booted it up in VirtualBox, I took a bunch of screenshots that I want to show you, because I don't put a lot of words on my slides, because I'm hoping you'll listen to me and not fall asleep and not read all the words on the slides. But this is what the screen looks like. Now, if you don't like this screen after you boot the computer, it's fully customizable. You can change the background, the panel along the bottom, which is called Plank. You can configure that to have any programs down there that you want. I personally prefer that versus the icons all over the background. Other people like the icons on the background. You can do whatever you want, a combination of both. It's all up to you. But this is how it starts. And the menu is in the top left-hand corner. There's that little blue circle that looks like the head of a rat or some such. And if you click that, you'll get into the menuing system where you can get at your ham radio programs and other programs that I've installed there. If you're a command line kind of person, you can bring up a terminal and do that too. pick and choose which way you would like to interface to the computer, and you can have fun any way you want. So did I mention that you should please read the Getting Started guide? Please. You'll save yourself and me a lot of logging in, then I know you didn't read it. And so please go ahead and read that. So you'll go through the standard installation. Now, if anybody's ever installed Ubuntu, I'm using the standard Ubuntu installer. So all those screens look just the way they would for Ubuntu. So I didn't bother to put them in here. Answer the questions about what your time zone is and how you want your hard disk configured and so forth. They're all pretty straightforward with default answers. And then when you get to the end of it and you followed my instructions in getting started, when you log in again, you'll see a screen that looks like this, and you'll know you did it right because the username that you gave it will show up there. So in this case, I gave it the name Andy, of course. And since it shows up in the box, I know I did that step correctly. If it says Xubuntu, you didn't do it right, and you'll have trouble logging in. So keep an eye out for that. And here's what the menu looks like. When you hit that little blue circle in the top corner, it expands into a menu that looks like this. You can customize that look. If you want a more traditional looking menu, you can get that, but it starts off this way. Now, one gentleman who did a very fair review of this software collection on YouTube commented that he thought the menu was a little disorganized. Well, if you were to click, ham radio further down or internet or some of those, you'd see some ham radio applications say, well, why is that in with internet? Or why is this one in ham radio? Or you might look at it and say, it doesn't meet my sense of what the organization of files should be. Well, I agree with you, but I didn't change that. And those come from the people who wrote the programs. For some reason, they decided that's the menu they wanted their program in. That's okay. You can fully customize that if you wish to. But what I did is I created a menu, and you can see it on the right. It's in gray, called Andy's Ham Radio Linux. And I organized things by my way of thinking. And that may or may not line up with yours. But again, that's customizable too. So what you can see down on the left-hand side is I categorize things. So there's software related to antennas and antenna modeling. There's some Morse code related software, digital modes. I put quite a bit of documentation on here, which you can get at, and I'll go through these in more detail in a bit. Electronic design. I hope there's still some tinkerers here who like to build kits and solder and maybe create schematics and all of that kind of thing. There's quite a bit of software in there. HF propagation, we're always interested in that. Logging, there's quite a few different logging programs in there. NBEAMS, the narrowband emergency messaging system, which is Dave, W1HKJ, and other folks. There's some software together that aids in that system. Rig control programs. Those of you who are into satellite, I think you'll be happy with this selection of software that's in there, and then things related to software-defined radio as well. So we're going to go through these in a bit. Let me take a breath for a second. Does anybody have any questions or comments of what we've talked about so far? No? Okay. So moving on, if you were to right-click on the background, you could get a window that looks like this, that allows you to choose different background screens. You don't have to have the Linux Tux Penguin there if you don't wish to. And I downloaded a bunch of these from sites. The images are covered under Creative Commons and other such things, so they can be redistributed legally. They're not copyrighted. And this is just a small sampling of what you can put there. And there's several others if you were to scroll down. And of course, you can download your own and put them in the backdrops directory and have those to choose from as well. So I wanted to point that out as one of the features that can be customized. For documentation, I won't swear that every document that's on the system is in this menu, but a lot of them are. And I organized it in the following way. There are some programs that only run from the command line. They're not graphically based. And some of them are listed there, and they have a standard Linux man page, which is text-based, that you can get at. And when you click here, it will bring up that terminal window so you can see the textual manual that comes with that program. Other things that you see there is if you go on the left of that menu where it says command line docs and move down to where it says Andy Ham Radio Linux, that's a bunch of documents that I created for how to do this or how to do that. How do you set up a rotator to talk to gpredict? I think I have a document in there for that. How do you do digital radio mondial, if I'm pronouncing it correctly? Things like that. How do you make the software do that? I've got apps in there. Or how do you do the NOAA weather satellites? There's a couple of setup things that I put in some text documents. There's a program called Direwolf, which has an awful lot of documents, and I put those in there for you. And all of the stuff, I call it the FL family of software, FL Digi, FL Amp, FL Message, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff that Dave W1HKJ has done has its own menu for those docs. And I try to keep them up to date, but of course, go to the website for that program to get the very latest. So if you were to click on the Andy Ham Radio Linux documentation directory, you'll get Firefox coming up, and it will show you a directory here in this screen of the documents that are available. And of course, I put the getting started document in there and all of that, but you've probably gotten past that at this point. But some of the things I mentioned are in here as how-to documents. They're all text files. And if you just click it, the right thing will happen and you'll be able to read the document, and hopefully it helps you. So there's quite a few things here. Other things that are in here, there's a file called release notes where I put a bunch of random, but I hope helpful tips in a few pages there. Some people wanted to know the versions of everything that I put in there. So I programmatically created that and put it in the versions file, the list of packages and so forth. There's other ways to get this, but I created that list to at least give you an idea of what's in there. So let's go down the list, and I'm not going to talk about every single program that's in there because some of them I'm much more familiar with than others, but I'll do a smattering of them just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that are available in the Andy's Ham Radio Linux software collection. So the first category is things that I call antenna. So there's one program that I wrote called FL MoxGen, which lets you pick your parameters and it gives you the dimensions for a Moxon rectangle antenna. It looks just like its Windows equivalent. And I remember years ago when I wrote it, I asked the gentleman who wrote that if I could copy his look and feel, and he said, sure. So now there's versions for Windows and Linux that look identical, but are very different in the code. RF exposure calculations, we've been asked to do those for our stations. And there's a couple of websites where you fill in some simple information, print and save the file, and you've got it in case anyone ever asks you. I doubt that they will, but you'll have it and you'll be compliant with that information. And this hooks up to one such website. And then, of course, the XNEC2C program for doing antenna modeling, which if you're into that, this program is pretty helpful. So I've got a couple of screenshots to show you. This is the one for FL MoxGen. You give it your frequency, you give it your wire size in either American wire gauge or what's the one in Europe? Is it standard wire gauge, I think? The gentleman sent me a patch for that one, and that's in there as well. And when you hit the calculate button, it will give you the dimensions in whatever units you have picked. The bottom right lets you pick the units. And you've got a picture here that shows the dimensions, the A, B, C, D, and E. And you can print that and take it to your garage or your workshop and make yourself an antenna. And I made one for 6 meters and it works pretty well. So you could do that if you chose to. This is a screenshot from XNEC2C. Oh, so before I go to that, sorry. In FL MoxGen, there is a section in the menu that says, print me the file that I can use to model this antenna in XNEC2C, because the syntax of that is really quite arcane. And I didn't want people to have to fuss with that. So it'll create the file, and then you read that file into XNEC2C. You can see the picture on the top right is a Moxon rectangle, turned up on its side this way. And then when you hit the go button, it will draw these graphs that show you front to back gain, SWR, and on the top left is the radiation pattern at whatever frequency the tool is sitting at. And so you can get some idea of what your antenna is going to behave like across the frequencies of interest. And so I think I set this one for something like 140 to 150 megahertz just to get a sweep out of it. What did I do? 138 to 153. So you get an idea of what the antenna is going to do. So there was another menu there with some CW related programs, and the top left one is just a standard CW drill. You listen to the tones that it creates in your computer speaker, and you write down the letters on your notebook, your piece of paper, and it shows you in the program what the letters are. So you'll get used to 5-letter groups at whatever speed you like, and you can keep practicing to improve your CW skills. You can change the tone, the volume, the words per minute, and so forth. And so that's handy for, I used it a lot when I was learning CW. I found it helpful to a point. Another program that I wrote is the one on the bottom right called MicroFox Config. There's a company out there called Bionics. Is anybody familiar with them? They have quite a few small devices out there for ham radio, and one of them is a MicroFox. It's a 2-meter Fox. You can pick your frequency in the GUI here. It transmits at approximately 15 milliwatts. And I have one and use it for fox hunting, and people chase the fox down. But this is the GUI for the program to configure it to behave the way you want it to. And you pick the USB port that it's plugged into. You can pick the duration. The tones that it transmits before it does CW are described numerically here. That's the way the device is designed. And once you set it up the way you want and hit the button that says write the config, it writes it in the device, and you have it forevermore. I don't remember if I copied the look and feel of a similar Windows program or not, but one thing I did add is a checksum, because I noticed that some devices had bad data and the device wouldn't work. So I added a checksum to it to make sure that that didn't happen. And this program will read that. So for those of you who are into fox hunting, you might consider going to the Bionics website and checking this out. So as we scroll further down the menus, you can see there's an awful lot of programs that I put into the menu called digital modes. And I'm guessing that people are familiar with FT8. You're probably familiar with PSK31 and the many other digital modes that are out there. And there are quite a number of programs that support any or all of those. And you can see the long list of them here. One that you may not be familiar with is FreeDV. That's a free software digital voice program, which was invented by a ham down in Australia. He's been doing the work for almost 10 years now. And it doesn't look like there's going to be any patent issues, because it's based on his prior art for his thesis in college. So I don't think we're going to have any trouble there. But other than the program that goes with that, there hasn't been a big uptake of that software until recently. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Other things in there, you know how FT8 is basically a quick hello, goodbye kind of QSO between your computer and theirs. Well, somebody decided they wanted to have a little more human interaction involved, much the way you did with PSK31, as long as your macros weren't talking to mine. And so with JS8 call, it uses the FT8 protocol, but it sends the message that you typed. And it may take several iterations of packets to get that across to the other person, but it does work. And so there are many people who like to use the FT8 protocol in a way that's a little bit more human than just computer to computer. And so that program is in there. QSS TV is for the folks who like to do slow scan TV. That program is in there. Of course, for FT8, there's the WSJTX software, which runs on many operating systems, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a selection in there for people to choose from. So this screen may look familiar. I don't think it looks much different in Windows or on an Apple machine. WSJTX for FT8, you can see the waterfall down below and decoded messages up on top. And I've used this quite a lot on Linux. I've had no trouble with it at all. It's a very well done piece of software. One piece of software that I think is excellent, but I didn't put it in this distribution, is called Grid Tracker. And I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but I think it creates some absolutely gorgeous maps, ties into Logbook of the World and other such services. You can draw, it will draw a map and show the grids of which grids you've contacted, which grids have been confirmed, and which grids you haven't gotten to yet. So it doesn't have to just be grids for a 6-meter Fred Fish Award. It could be, wherever you choose to collect grids, it will track them for you. And it does a fantastic job of that. Some of the maps are downright gorgeous, in my opinion. And I strongly encourage you to install it. And I have a how-to grid tracker there to do that. It's the reason, there's 2 reasons I didn't install it. And one of them is it wants to install in your home directory. And that's a Windows-ism, not a Linux-ism. And so, yeah, that'll work for you, but it would be better if it installed in a system level directory so multiple users could access it without having to install it each time for each user. The other issue that I am fairly convinced exists is that it keeps the user data in a system directory, not the home directory. On a Unix system or Linux system, that's bad, bad, bad. You don't do that, because as soon as you upgrade, you're likely to lose that data. And I need to file a proper bug on the grid tracker team to get them to address that. And then when that happens, or they explain to me that I'm wrong, one or the other, then I would be more than happy to add grid tracker to this collection. It is a most excellent piece of software with that minor exception. It also talks directly to WSJTX. And so the two tie together. You can hook it up to Logbook of the World, and when QSLs come in, it will download that information and update the grids on a map. And as you change bands, it changes the map on the fly. It's really slick. And so here is a screenshot of, ooh, that looks good. There's a screenshot of WSJTX, and you'll see all the red squares are stations that I've contacted via FT8 and gotten QSL'd. Yellow ones I've contacted, but there's no QSL. And if it's just the map, then it's an area that I've not yet contacted. You may also see a couple of green lines on there, especially from USA over to Europe. Those are contacts in progress that my radio can hear both sides. So it knows what's going on there. And sometimes you'll get an awful lot of those, and other times there won't be too many, but it does that live. Now, if that feature bothers you, you can turn it off. That's okay. But it's in there. It kind of gives you a feel for where the propagation is going at any given time. And I find it to be a handy feature. If you look on the right-hand side of the grid tracker screen, you'll see there's a 5x5 array of graphics where one's a question mark and one's the gear for configuring and so forth. And you can hit those buttons and it will change the way grid tracker behaves. And if you hover over those, it will give you a quick tooltip to let you know what it wants to do. And down below, there's a window that's got 3 call signs in it. And what it does is it will decode the call signs it sees based on a filter that you set. And the filter is highly configurable. So if you were to say, I only want to see people calling CQ, you can do that. If you say, I only want to see grids that I don't yet have and anybody else, I don't want to see that because I don't want to contact them. You can set the filter that way, and many, many other settings that you can put in for the filter. And so that can come in handy. But on the other hand, if you only see people calling CQ and that station from Thailand is out there and they never have a chance to call CQ, you might miss it. So be careful what you filter, because you might possibly miss something that would be interesting to you. But excellent piece of software. I encourage you to download it, and I'll do my best to get it in the next version of Andy's Ham Radio Linux. So I already talked about the documentation, so I'm not going to go into that again. Electronic design. There are lots of people out there who like to design circuit boards and ham radio kits that are put together. All people write Arduino code. I've done a lot of that, and I enjoy it. Sometimes people are building their own radio circuits from scratch and need to know how many turns of wire around a coil form of such and such size will give me X number of microhenries. There's a program in here for that. There's a SPICE program. SPICE has been a great analog simulator for a lot of years, and there's a copy of that in here. KiCad is another schematic program. There's programs in here for PC board layout. There's a simple program in here for resistors and their color codes and what value is it. And if you've never done this before, it's helpful to have. I would say get out your own meter and measure it, because on some parts, the color codes are so faded, you can't tell what it should be. Or parts from certain other countries, the colors were just bad to begin with, and you really can't tell what they are. So there's multiple ways to handle that. Smith charts and schematic programs and other such things are all in there for folks who enjoy that aspect of the hobby. So here's an Arduino window. And for those of you who might not know what Arduino is, it's a way to program a circuit board to do various things. It's not just a program, but it wants to interface to hardware. So it could be as simple as blinky lights and switches and little motors and things like that, or it could be much more complex, such as the microBitX radio, which has an Arduino inside of it controlling the VFOs, the frequency you tune to, and so on and so forth. And so this is there for people. And if you want to write software in it, you have this, or you can see the source code that somebody else has done and learn from it. And so this happens to be a snippet of a program that I wrote for a circuit board called Dr. Duino. And if you read QST, you've seen those folks advertised there. This was from a couple of years ago when they first started. And we had a kit building exercise in my basement where 6 or 8 of my fellow hams came over and we put together Dr. Duino's, and some people's didn't work correctly the first time and it was tricky to figure out why. So I wrote this diagnostic that goes through everything so we could isolate what didn't work, and then we could find, you know, the cold solder joint or the solder bridge or whatever much more expediently. And so had fun doing that. Here's a coil program that I talked about. I've used it a couple of times. It works well. I think it's cool looking. It doesn't look really old, like admittedly, some Linux software looks kind of dated, but it still works well. But this one is clearly of a much more modern to winding your own coils. This could be helpful. And of course, the KiCad schematic editor, which I've not done schematic entry for Linux or ham radio. I did it way back when in the beginning of my career at work. But there's programs in there for that as well. Let me take a breath for a second. Does anybody have any questions on stuff that we've done up to now, Bob? Called which?
Eagle to
Oh.
print, to make your own circuit boards.
So I vaguely remember a program called Eagle for making circuit boards, but I don't have it in here. And I'm not sure if it's free software or proprietary.
They do have a free version, and that takes you there.
Okay, is it free as in no cost or free as in free software?
It was completely free. In fact, I made a circuit board with it.
Okay,
But the size, the free version, the size, you could only make a circuit board by 4 inches by 5 inches. something
Sure.
like that. And then if you wanted to make anything bigger,
Right.
you had to buy
it's right. Okay, so it's free as in cost, not free as in
But
free
everything
software.
was there to make the circuit
Right. So in that case, I probably would not be able to legally distribute it because it's not free software or open source. But it's out there. And I mean, if it works on Linux, I'm not going to do anything to stop you from using it. I mean, that's your choice, you know. But I have a couple that are in here that are completely free software. And again, for folks that are interested in that aspect of the hobby, there's tools here to help you with that. So for HF propagation, there's a couple of programs that I've put in here. One of them just downloads the information from somebody else's website, and I have their permission to do that. And you may recognize the top image. You've probably seen that on many people's websites. And if you click the button in the menu, you can get that displayed on your Linux machine as well. Now, it's not dynamic. You know, a couple hours later, if this is different, you've got to click the button again because it's a static image, I believe. But you can get it to find out what the bands look like they're doing now. And then another program I found is called QGrid, where you type in 2 grid locations. It'll tell you the latitude and longitude, the bearing, the distance, and so forth. And it's kind of handy to have it locally, but sure, there's other places to get that information. And one of the buttons in the menu there will take you to the VOA CAP website, which will give you predictions as to what time of day and what frequency is most likely to get you from point A to point B. So if you look at the map on the right, you'll see that the red marker is approximately on Boston, Massachusetts. And I typed in the grid FN42GO, which is my grid. And then the other grid is somewhere in South Africa at some relatively arbitrary grid KF17SK. And so if I wanted to contact that part of the world, I'd like to know what frequency should I be on, what time of day to give me the best likelihood of making that contact. And so you set that up in the tool and then click the propagation wheel button, and you get the display on the left, which if you look at it, you'll see the different bands, 10, 12, 15, 17, all the way down to 80, and the different colors around the circle. And the legend at the bottom shows you that the closer the color is to red, the more likely you are to make the contact. Now, there's no guarantees. We know the HF propagation gods don't always guarantee that, but it's a probability. It's a predicted probability. And so it looks like your best chance is probably on 15 meters, right around 14 to 1700 hours, and a couple more before and after that. And so I find this very handy. This is not running natively on the computer. This is just going through the website to get there. But I included it in the menu because I think it's really helpful, and I use it a lot, and I kind of wanted it to be there, so I put it there for you. This is a logging program that I did not write, but I'm the current maintainer of it. It's called Xlog. It's a fairly simple logging program. It does just that. It logs and pretty much no more. And that can be fine for certain classes of use. I have used it in contests before because I know the keyboard shortcuts, but I'm sure if I was a serious contester, I'd want something with different features. But this is the one, and what you see is what you get. The GUI is fairly simple. You fill in your QSO on the left-hand side in all those boxes, and when you hit right, it will update the log, which it shows on the right-hand side. And there you go. You can export that to ADIF and upload it to Logbook of the World or EQSL, wherever you'd like to go with it. And yeah, I know that the dates on those QSOs are 2010, but the GUI hasn't changed because it's mature software. I'm not aware of any bugs in it. Nobody's reported any to me in a long time. And so it's actually the logger that I use almost all the time. It does have rig control. So if you hit the right key sequence, it will fill in the QSO box with the mode and the frequency that you're in. It fills in the time and the date, and it will try to read the RST, but the S meter bounces around so much, you're probably better off filling that in. But then you can log your QSOs that way. WSJTX now talks to Xlog. And so if you're using that, the contact will automatically be sent to Xlog, and you don't have to key in anything. It just does it for you. And I put that in relatively recently. And I use it all the time, so I'm sure it works. And when it breaks, I'll be encouraged to fix it. Another logger that has many more features is CQR log. It uses a database in its backend. I believe it's MySQL that it uses. And there's a lot more features here. I believe that once you put in the call sign, you can set it up to query QRZ or whomever to get other information about that user filled into the log here. And this is another one that's undergoing a lot of development. It's very actively developed and used. And those are the two big ones that I'm aware of. There are other Linux loggers. I've put 2 or 3 of them in here, and there may be others that I don't know of. So if somebody knows of a Linux logger that's free software or open source that I've not put in here, let me know and I'll check it out. If it looks reasonable, I'm happy to put it in. So the NBeams stuff, MCOM people like to use this, the narrowband emergency messaging system. Many people use WinLink, other people use this one. I don't know that they're competing because I don't know much about that area, but they are 2 different possible solutions to sending messages that are error-free and so forth. And I think there's actually more programs that belong under that menu, but FLDigi is used. FL Message has the standard messaging formats that the folks use. And then the Silfeed email program can tie into this somehow as well. And I haven't used the tools that way, but other people have, and they say that it works pretty well. I believe there's a group in Pennsylvania and perhaps others that are using the NBeam system for their work, and they seem to be very happy with it. Rig control programs, if you have an HT or a mobile rig that you want to program, Chirp is the program to do it. That talks to an awful lot of different radios. Check their website. The list is constantly changing and improving. And FLRig and GRig are generic rig control programs. And WFView, which I'm sure I have a screenshot of, is a relatively new one that I don't think too many people know about. So I've talked about NBeams. There we go. So the WFView program is a relatively new one that the author contacted me about and asked me if I would distribute it. And it's designed to talk to ICOM rigs, so 7300, 7610s, and several other versions of this program is able to talk to. And you can see the waterfall display in the middle. You can see the display on top that shows you what the band is doing, as well as the waterfall. And if you click on the bright lines in the waterfall, it will tune your rig to that station. And down below, you can change the menus and do other things to tune in the station of interest, set the mode, sideband, CW, whatever. And you can control many features of your rig from this GUI. I'm not sure that there's a GUI anywhere that lets you get at every single feature of your rig, but this does the basics, and it does it pretty well. So for satellite work, we know that AMSAT has a bunch of satellites up there, and one of them is the Fox series of satellites. And so this Fox telemetry program, which comes from AMSAT, lets you, if you have the right gear to listen to a satellite transmission, some of what it transmits is telemetry, And if your radio is hooked to the computer and running this program, then it will decode that telemetry information and fill in the blanks for you. And I believe there's a way that you can forward that information to AMSAT so that they can keep track of how healthy the satellites are. You know, if a problem should arise, they can address it and so forth. And there are many, many different satellites supported by this program, as you can see by the various tabs as input in AO85, AO91, et cetera. And many of them are supported. This is a program that I used quite a bit a few years ago when I was doing more satellite work called gPredict. And what it will do is it will draw a map that you can see there, a world map, and it shows you the satellites that you've chosen to display near your home QTH. And so you can see the big circle or elliptical pattern, which is, you know, think of a satellite as being up in the air and almost like shining a flashlight beam down on the planet. Well, that's the area that you can see, quote unquote, the satellite. And if you're within that circle, you have a fair chance of making a communication with that satellite. Trees and things will get in your way, so you might really need to be at 40 degrees or whatever, or if you're in the middle of a soccer field, maybe not. But this lets you know, if you download the most recent information, it will tell you, like this here in the white, it says next SO50 in 1933, 19 minutes and 33 seconds. So if the TLE information is up to date, it will do those predictions correctly. It will, when the satellite is in range, it will draw a line northwest, southeast, showing you where in the sky the satellite is. So if you're aiming your antenna manually, you have a fighting chance of knowing where to aim. And this program comes in very handy. What I discovered about satellites is that you end up scheduling your life around the satellite, not the other way around. And that's okay if you're into it, but sometimes it gets a little inconvenient. But the nice thing is the satellites come by periodically, so you'll have another chance. So for software-defined radio, a program that I have just started using and appreciating is called GNU Radio Companion. So GNU Radio is a free software library of, I guess I'll call them modules. I don't know if that's quite the right word, that have many different components that are of interest to people who do software-defined radio. And with the GNU Radio Companion, you can draw a high-level block diagram of the thing that you want to describe as a signal processing algorithm. And you literally connect the boxes together. It checks to make sure that the data types between the output of one box and the input of another are matching. And you can then right click each box and change its characteristics. So for example, if a box is a filter, you can describe how tight the skirts are and what the bandwidth of that filter is and so forth. And it will do it all programmatically. So when you have the diagram drawn correctly and there are no errors, hit the go button and it will write the Python code and then execute the program for you. And what I did is I hooked up one of those very inexpensive RTL SDR dongles to it. And you can see in this is the picture that I did. And I did not do this from scratch. I got this from a tutorial, but you can see the RTL SDR source, which is the box over on the left here. Sorry, camera folks. And then there's a low pass filter and some other boxes that are put in there. Some of them for graphical handling of which station I'm listening to, what the volume is and so forth. And there's a box in there called WBFM receive, wideband FM receiver. And that does the demodulation. Imagine that, all the demodulation in one box. You don't need to know those details. It's there for you. Now, if you want to know them, it's free and open source software. Dive in and look at the code. But if you want to think of things at a higher level, you can do that here. And so when you push the green triangle, that's the go button. And then you end up with a display that looks like this. And all I did is put two boxes on that other flow diagram to get these graphics to appear. I didn't have to know anything about how to program these graphics at all. They're canned, they're in there, and for a lot of things, they more than suffice. So what you see up top is a waterfall where this is listening to WCRB 99.5 megahertz out of Boston, Classical Radio Boston. And you can also, interestingly, see the digital sidebands next to it, where nowadays most stations have some sort of digital information carried with them. And if you have a relatively new radio, it will display that for you as well, often the name of the song, or sometimes it's an ad for a law firm, or who knows what it might be. But you can also see down below what the radio signals look like between, what is it, 98.5 and 100.5. So that device is limited to 2 megahertz of spectrum at a time. There are other SDR devices out there that are much wider. They can do 20 megahertz or more. They cost a lot more, but for 25 bucks, you can dip your toe into the water and have some fun with this technology. Here's another program called GQRX that's out there. You don't draw any boxes or block diagrams. You just hook it up to your radio, to the correct USB port, and you set the parameters. On the right, you can see I want a wide filter, I want narrow FM, and so forth. And you may recognize the frequency 162.525 as one of the NOAA weather radio frequencies. And so I was tuned into that one day listening to the weather. Here's a program that I just learned about, and I've not used it yet, so I can't go into any detail about it. It's called SDR Angel, and it looks like it's got an awful lot of features to it. The different parts of the GUI are customizable. You can lay them out the way you want. You can pick the pieces you need, don't need, and so forth. I have not played with it. Take a look at their website to get a tutorial and learn more about how to use it. But I saw it. It looks like there's a lot of features in there, and I wanted to include it to get it in people's hands so they can try it out. This one will decode APRS. It will decode ADSB for aircraft. It's got quite a few of those decoders built into it. And it looked really cool when I saw it on the website. I just have not had time to play with it yet. So what's new and what's cool, or at least my opinion of what's new and what's cool? Well, the free digital voice has been out there for quite a while. That's not new, but there is still active work going on to reduce the bit rates and see how high the audio quality can be. Is it high quality audio, or is it communications grade, or is it robotic, but you still know the words? They've taken great pains to get some kind of a voice out of it before the signal is so weak that it just drops off. As we know, anybody who has an HD TV knows that you don't get static when you're not quite tuned in well. It's either all or nothing. And if you live between two hills like I do and probably are suffering multipath distortion, I don't know which way to aim my antenna to fix that. So I just have to kind of do it randomly. But they've designed this protocol so that it fails a bit more gracefully than, say, your HD TV, where it's either all or nothing. And so that work is ongoing, but there's a new project, and a couple of the folks on the project are here in New Hampshire. I spoke to them at the most recent Nearfest last fall, and it's called the M17 project. Now, be careful when you look at that. I think there's a machine gun named M17 also, but if you look for M17 and radio, I think you'll find it. I've got the link there. They are designing some low-level protocols that use the codec 2 codec, and there's a particular radio that they are hacking up, and they are reloading that radio's firmware with OpenRTX. They're using the codec 2 thing so that you can do digital voice in a completely free software way with the stuff that they're doing. Now, they're not writing the user applications. They're writing the low-level protocols. Someone will need to come along and write the user applications to fully take advantage of this. They have a page on Facebook where you can talk to them, and they have a couple of other places where you can, I think they have a thing on Groups.io, but go to their website and check it out. One of their things, not just in doing the protocols, but they want to encourage people to tinker and to hack with it and invent the protocols and write the software. And it's a different kind of tinkering than maybe folks did 40 or 50 years ago, but with modern computers and things, you can do a lot with them. And a lot of the younger folks in the hobby are very, very skilled in this area. And so we get to benefit from that as they write this software and contribute it back to the community. So I wanted folks to get a feel for how many folks are downloading this. I'm very enthusiastic about it, but then again, I created it, and I'm happy that so many people use it. But as I said, I had created it before I ever shared it, so I would probably do that work anyway. But once I figured out how to package up and share it with people, I was really happy to do that. And the first version that I released was in 2011. I called it version 8. Versions 1 through 7 were, in my opinion, just not worthy of going out the door, so I didn't. But I can't tell how many downloads it was, but it was a small number, maybe a couple of hundred, based on Ubuntu 10.10. And then you can see over time, the downloads grew. And by the time I got to version 14 in the year 2013, the number of downloads was in the ballpark of about 7,000. and the number of downloads varies, partly because sometimes I leave a version out for 3 months and then update it because there's a good reason to, and other times a version might be there for a year before I update it. And so, mileage varies. One time, Mad Dog went down to Brazil and was talking to college students down there about all things Linux. And he came back a week or so later, and I noticed a huge uptick in the number of downloads. And I looked, there were 400 downloads in a week from Brazil. I wonder how that happened. Thank you, Mad Dog. But I've seen things like that. The gentleman on YouTube who very recently did a review of version 25 of Andy's Ham Radio Linux, 2 days later, the downloads spiked to 200 a day for quite a few days before they tapered off. So there have been some distinct events that will line up with the number of downloads. But you can see here where version 25 at the end has already had about 2,300 downloads. It's only been out there for what, 6 or 7 weeks at this point, something like that. I released it end of June. But the version before that, version 24, had something like 12,000 downloads. Well, let's be fair. There was about 5 versions of version 24, A, B, C, D, and E, and I lumped them all together because I just didn't want that many columns on the graph. So it's not entirely consistent. I number them sequentially because I'm an engineer, that's what we do. But a few of them are a little different from that. And so that's how that's working. And then one day, much to my very pleasant surprise, I got this email from the folks at SourceForge, and they sent me a PDF file saying, hey, you won an award. Congratulations. The Andy's Ham Radio Linux software has hit the threshold of 100,000 downloads in the 11 years that it's been out there. And I have to tell you, I was totally blown away. I had no idea that there were that many downloads. And I think there's 1 or 2 people with bad internet connections that are very persistent. But so thank you to all of you who have downloaded it, tried it, and so forth. That kind of thing helps, to keep me motivated to do it. And also, I was pleased that the Eastern Mass Division wrote a quick article about this work and posted it on their website. And so I want to thank Phil Temples for that. So as I've mentioned, it's on the SourceForge website. Search for my call sign, and you can find Andy's Ham Radio Linux and other pieces of software that I've written or collaborated with. The MicroBitX software that I wrote, which took some of Ashar Farhan's code and kept it, and the rest I redid completely. I modified my version of that radio for blind amateur radio operators to use. And I had a visually impaired fellow kickstart or kick the tires on a prototype, and he liked what he experienced. So the Bionics configuration programs are in there. I collaborated with K1IG George to come up with something called Wordsworth. And I believe George got a cover plaque award for that. And I helped him with a couple of Perl scripts to generate word lists that would facilitate learning CW with this method that he calls Wordsworth. And then the AA Analyzer program, which I wrote a long time ago, it's a Perl script for getting the data out of RigExpert analyzers. It doesn't work with some of the newer models. I haven't had a chance to update it, but some of the older models it works with just fine. And it gives you the data in a CSV file, and you can load that into whatever you want to load it into, a spreadsheet or wherever, and then do with that data as you wish. Okay, here's my last slide. I want to thank you for coming to the talk, and thank you for recording it so that others who couldn't be here can view this. I will be giving a very similar talk at the Ham Exposition at the end of August in Marlborough, Massachusetts. So if you missed the talk, you can see it there. Or if you want to come speak to me in person, I'd love to talk to you. I'll be there Friday night, all day Saturday, and all day Sunday. And so I'd love to meet you and hear about your experiences and any constructive feedback that you might have where we could potentially make this software collection better. So Bob, question? So when I'm on 2 meters, I'm on the WB1GOF 955 2-meter repeater. I listen most of the time during the day because nowadays I work from home. And so you can either contact me there, or I have my email on here as kb10iq@arrl.net. So you can send me email there as well. And a copy of the recording will be available. A copy of the slides will be available. And are there any questions either from the physically present audience or the folks online? Yes.
Those of us that already have a distro installed, do you just have a list of the software so we can just download it into our existing distro easily?
So the question is, do I have a list of the software that I put on here so that folks could add it to the existing distro they already have, so you don't have to reinstall, everything, because what you have works. If you look through the versions and the packages files that I created, I believe you can get that list from there. I also have listed quite a few of them in the release notes, but I might have skipped something. But I don't have any kind of a command script that would do the apt install for you or anything of that nature. But the lists are available, and I believe they're reasonably complete. Are there other questions? No?
Any online? I didn't see any hands go up. Actually, if we go to here,
Okay.
you'll see more folk here.
Have you done any firewall configuration?
The question that I heard was, have I done any firewall configuration? No, I have not. I focused on Linux and well, not just Linux, but the ham radio software is my focus, but there is a firewall configuration software available. I didn't explicitly add it. If it's in there already, that could be useful, but you can also install anything else on it that you want and augment it that way.
Yeah, I was just thinking it might get the naive user out of trouble to have a basic configuration.
Sure, I could see that. Other questions from anybody? No? All right, well, I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. I had a lot of fun giving the talk. Thanks for everybody for coming, both online and in person. And with that, I will say that I'm KB10IQ and I'm clearing QRT. Hey, my pleasure, thanks.
Meet Mike.
Oh,
Thank you very much for your presentation, Andy. It was very informative. Hopefully that'll, if people have any extra hardware lying around, perhaps they'll go and install Linux and play with a bunch of the great software that is out there, and provide a nice, easy way for folks to be able to do that. And so very good. So if there's no other questions or comments, I will conclude the meeting for today. Again, thank you very much, Andy, for traveling up here to give your presentation. And next month it'll be Steve doing a presentation, and we hope to see you all then. So 7-3, everyone.